The crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore Conservatory cast geometric patterns across the marble floor, each facet catching the late afternoon sun and throwing it back in calculated brilliance. Joseph Stewart pushed his mop across those patterns, watching them fracture and reform with each stroke, the way he'd watched them for 7 years now. The water in his bucket had gone from clear to gray, picking up the invisible residue of 1,000 polished shoes that had crossed this hall today. Shoes that cost more than his monthly rent, worn by people who never looked down long enough to see him there. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you liked the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. The conservatory hummed with its usual Friday energy. Through the tall windows lining the eastern wall, Joseph could see students hurrying across the manicured grounds, instrument cases clutched to their chests like precious cargo. A cellist rushed past, nearly knocking over his yellow caution sign, her apology thrown over her shoulder without breaking stride. He smiled anyway, straightening the sign with practiced efficiency. She probably had a recital tonight. They all did on Fridays. That's when the donors came, when the building transformed from a school into a showcase, when his presence became even more invisible than usual. Joseph, are you listening? Marcus Webb's voice cut through his thoughts. Marcus, the security guard who'd become something close to a friend over the years, stood near the main entrance with his arms crossed. His uniform pressed sharp despite the heat. At 63, Marcus carried himself with the posture of a man who'd once been military and never quite left it behind. I'm listening, Joseph called back, though he hadn't been. I said they're expecting over 300 people tonight. The Pemberton Gala, biggest event of the season. Marcus walked closer, his shoes clicking against the marble with authority. They want all the floors done by 6, every window spotless, and, he paused, lowering his voice, they want you gone by 7, not working, gone. Joseph nodded slowly, wringing out his mop with methodical twists. The water spiraled down, carrying with it another layer of the day's accumulation. Same as always, then. Same as always, Marcus confirmed, but something in his tone suggested otherwise. Except this year, there's something different. New dean, new money, new rules. Dr. Catherine Ashford. She's been here 3 months and already turned this place on its head. Word is she's bringing in some international pianist. Someone famous. They're unveiling a new Steinway tonight, custom-made. Supposedly cost more than most houses. The mention of the piano made Joseph's hands still on the mop handle. Marcus always noticed, but had the grace not to comment. Instead, he shifted his weight and continued. They've got it covered up in the Founders Hall. Security posted at both doors. No one gets in until the big reveal at 8:30. Sounds fancy, Joseph said, forcing his hands back into motion. Fancy doesn't cover it. Exclusive. That's the word Dr. Ashford keeps using. She wants everything perfect. Which means she wants people like us. Marcus gestured between them. Invisible. Or better yet, not here at all. Through the western corridor, Joseph could hear the sharp staccato of heels approaching. Both men recognized the sound before the woman appeared. Dr. Catherine Ashford moved through the conservatory like a winter storm. Beautiful, cold, and impossible to ignore. Her blonde hair sat in a perfect chignon. Her navy suit probably cost what Joseph made in 3 months. And her eyes swept over everything with the calculating precision of someone always looking for flaws. 2 people flanked her. On her left, Trevor Whitmore III, the conservatory's largest benefactor and grandson of its founder, wore his privilege like a second skin. Expensive but casual, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself. On her right, Professor Helena Zhao, head of the piano department, carried a leather portfolio and wore the expression of someone who'd been talking for the past hour without being heard. The acoustics in Founders Hall have been optimized, Professor Zhao was saying, her accent carrying traces of Beijing despite 30 years in Boston. The Steinway will sound magnificent, but I still think we should reconsider the performance order. Starting with Chopin might be too. The order is set. Dr. Ashford cut her off, not unkindly but with finality. Her gaze swept past Joseph as if he were furniture, landing on Marcus instead. "Mr. Webb, I trust all cleaning staff will be finished and off the premises by 7? "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied. "Joseph here is our most efficient worker. He'll have everything spotless." Dr. Ashford's eyes finally found Joseph, and for a moment, there was something in her expression. Not cruelty exactly, but the absent assessment of someone looking at a tool rather than a person. "Good. Tonight is crucial for the conservatory's reputation. We have donors from New York, London, even Tokyo. Everything must be impeccable." "It will be," Joseph said quietly, meeting her gaze with the steady neutrality he'd perfected over years of being overlooked. She nodded once, already moving past them, her heels resuming their rhythm. Trevor Whitmore 3 followed without acknowledging either man's existence. Professor Zhao lingered for just a moment, offering Joseph a small, apologetic smile before hurrying after them. When they were gone, Marcus exhaled heavily. 7 years you've been here, and that woman's looked at you maybe 3 times. 4, Joseph corrected with a slight smile. "But who's counting? You ever get tired of it?" Marcus asked, the question carrying more weight than the words themselves. Joseph squeezed out his mop again, watching the dirty water swirl. "Every day. But the pay's steady, the work's honest, and I get to hear music. Could be worse. Could be better, too. Could be," Joseph agreed, but didn't elaborate. Marcus checked his watch. "I've got to do my rounds. You need anything?" "I'm good. Thanks, Marcus." The security guard walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into the building's ambient symphony. Distant scales being practiced, a violin searching for the right pitch, someone running through the same measure of Mozart over and over, trying to nail a trill. Joseph returned to his mopping, working his way toward the eastern wing where the practice rooms lined up like cells in a monastery, each one a tiny world of concentrated effort and dreams. Most had windows looking into the hallway, allowing him glimpses of the students within. A young woman with red hair wrestled with a French horn, her face red with effort. 2 violinists in the next room practiced a duet, occasionally stopping to argue over tempo. A pianist with headphones sat at an upright, his hands moving over keys Joseph couldn't hear, lost in whatever music played in his ears. But it was the room at the end of the hall that made Joseph slow his pace. Room 12. Through its window, he could see it was empty, the old upright piano inside sitting silent and waiting. This piano was different from the others, older, its finish worn in places, the ivory on several keys yellowed with age. It had been relegated to this room years ago when the conservatory upgraded, considered too imperfect for serious study. Joseph had never played it, never even touched it. That was one of the unspoken rules. Janitors cleaned the rooms, but the instruments belonged to students, faculty, the talented, the chosen, people who paid tuition, people who belonged. But he knew every key of that piano, knew the slight stick on middle C, the way F sharp in the second octave rang just a fraction flat, the responsive action of the lower register compared to the stiff keys at the top. He knew this because he'd watched hundreds of students play it over the years, had heard its voice in every possible variation. Triumphant, frustrated, exploratory, defeated. He also knew things about the piano that the students didn't. Knew that if you sat with perfect posture, aligned your shoulders just right, the bench wouldn't creak. Knew that the sostenuto pedal was slightly loose and needed gentle pressure. Knew the resonance patterns of the room itself, how sound gathered in the back left corner, and how the window dampened the higher frequencies. Knowledge gained through observation, through patience, through 7 years of invisible presence. Joseph finished the eastern wing and moved toward the southern corridor, where the administrative offices sat dark and empty, everyone having gone home early to prepare for tonight's event. The silence here was different, not the charged silence of practice rooms, but the dead silence of bureaucracy at rest. He cleaned methodically, his mind wandering to the usual places. His apartment, a studio on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. His neighbor Mrs. Chun, who cooked too much and always left containers of food outside his door with notes in shaky English. His other job, weekend shifts at a warehouse loading dock, where at least his coworkers learned his name. His sister Elena in Chicago, who called once a month to check on him and worry aloud about his choices. "You're too smart for this," she'd said last week, her voice crackling through his cheap phone. "You could do something more. Be something more." "I am something," he'd replied. "I'm reliable." She'd sighed then, that particular sigh of hers that contained entire conversations. Frustration, love, disappointment, hope, all tangled together. The memory dissolved as Joseph reached the main foyer again. 6 o'clock. The light through the windows had shifted, turning golden, painting the marble in warmer tones. Through the glass, he could see the first cars beginning to arrive, sleek vehicles disgorging well-dressed people who moved toward the entrance with the confidence of those who'd been invited. Marcus appeared again, this time with Sandra Chun, another security guard, young and eager, who'd only been here 6 months. "Joseph, you're doing great. Just need you to hit the restrooms one more time, then you're done for the night." "On it?" Joseph replied, gathering his supplies. The restrooms near Founders Hall were the conservatory's finest. All marble and brass, with soap that smelled expensive and paper towels that felt like cloth. Joseph cleaned them with the same attention he gave everything else, not because anyone would notice, but because doing a job halfway had never sat right with him. As he worked, he could hear activity building in the adjacent Founders Hall. Voices, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Someone was testing a microphone. Check, check, 1, 2. The sound bleeding through the walls. Underneath it all, very faintly, he heard what might have been scales being played on a piano. Not the new Steinway, that was still covered, still waiting for its grand reveal. This was someone warming up somewhere else, their notes floating through the building's ventilation system like musical ghosts. Joseph paused, his hand on the paper towel dispenser he was refilling, and listened. The scales shifted into an arpeggio, then a chord progression he recognized, Rachmaninoff, Prelude in C-sharp minor. Whoever was playing knew what they were doing. The notes were confident, powerful, building toward that crushing climax that made the piece famous. For just a moment, standing in a bathroom that smelled of lemon cleaner, Joseph closed his eyes and let his fingers move against the cool metal of the dispenser. Muscle memory, phantom keys, the sensation of ivories beneath his fingertips though there were none. His right hand traced the melodic line while his left found the deep bass notes, his body remembering what his life no longer allowed. "Joseph!" Marcus's voice brought him back. The security guard stood in the doorway, his expression gentle. "You okay, man?" "Yeah." Joseph opened his eyes, lowered his hands. "Yeah. Just tired. It's almost 7. You should head out. Beat the crowd. I'll finish up here first. 5 more minutes." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but then you go. Okay? Don't linger." Ashford's been clear about that. When Marcus left, Joseph completed his work quickly, efficiently, his hands steady despite the tremor he'd felt while listening to the Rachmaninoff. He stored his cleaning supplies in the janitor's closet, changed out of his work uniform into jeans and a clean but worn button-down shirt, and prepared to leave. But as he walked toward the employee exit, his route took him past the southern corridor, and the southern corridor passed by Founders Hall. The double doors to the hall were propped open now, and through them, Joseph could see the transformation. The space had been converted into something magical. Round tables covered in white cloth, each centerpiece a small forest of orchids, lighting that turned the room amber and intimate. At the far end, on a raised platform, sat something large and rectangular covered in black silk. The Steinway, waiting. Around the room, people in evening wear clustered in conversation. Tuxedos and gowns, jewelry that caught the light, postures that spoke of confidence and belonging. Joseph recognized a few faces from newspaper articles. Local politicians, university presidents, a tech CEO who'd made billions before 40. The Boston elite gathered to celebrate their own sophistication, their patronage of the arts, their position at the pinnacle of culture. He should have kept walking, should have left through the employee exit, caught his bus, gone home to his empty apartment and the leftover stir-fry Mrs. Chun had left him yesterday. Instead, Joseph found himself stepping closer to those open doors, not entering but standing just outside, watching the scene with the fascination of someone observing a foreign country. "Excuse me." The voice was cold, clipped. Joseph turned to find a young woman in a staff uniform, catering, from the look of it, staring at him with barely concealed disdain. "This area is for guests only. Employees should use the side entrance." "I was just leaving," she finished for him. "Yes, please do." Joseph nodded, began to turn away, but froze when he heard the voice from inside the hall. Dr. Ashford, amplified by a microphone, her words clear and carrying. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Your generosity makes evenings like this possible, and more importantly, makes the Whitmore Conservatory a beacon of musical excellence." Applause rippled through the room. Joseph found himself unable to move, caught by something in that moment. The unfairness of it, perhaps, or the strange magnetism of witnessing a world he'd never inhabit. "Tonight," Dr. Ashford continued, "we celebrate not just music, but the dedication required to achieve true artistry, the countless hours of practice, the sacrifice, the unwavering commitment to perfection. These are qualities that separate the exceptional from the merely competent." More applause. Someone laughed. Joseph felt something tighten in his chest. "And to honor that dedication," Dr. Ashford said, "we have acquired an instrument worthy of our students' talents. A Steinway Model D, custom-built in Hamburg, with—" "Hey!" The catering staff member had returned, this time with a supervisor. "I told you to leave. This is a private event." "I'm going," Joseph said quietly. "Should have already gone," the supervisor added. "Who are you, anyway?" "Janitor. I was just finishing up." The supervisor's expression shifted from annoyance to dismissal. "Well, you're finished now. Let's go." Joseph walked away, the supervisor following at a short distance as if to ensure compliance. Behind him, he heard Dr. Ashford's voice rising to a crescendo. "And to perform for us tonight, straight from her acclaimed European tour, please welcome the extraordinary virtuoso Chan Wei." The applause that followed was thunderous. Joseph pushed through the employee exit into the cool evening air. The sun had set, leaving behind a sky painted in purples and deep blues. The employee parking lot was nearly empty. Most staff had left hours ago. His bus stop sat 2 blocks away, beneath a streetlight that flickered with electrical uncertainty. As he walked, Joseph reached into his pocket and touched the small object he always carried. A key. Not to any door in the conservatory, but to something else, something private. His fingers traced its familiar shape, the teeth, the bow, the tiny imperfection where the metal had been filed down years ago. He'd tell himself he was going home, would board the bus, ride the 40 minutes through neighborhoods that grew progressively shabbier, climb the stairs to his apartment, heat up his dinner, maybe read or watch something on his ancient television. That's what he'd tell himself. But even as he waited at the bus stop, even as the number 47 pulled up with a hydraulic hiss and opened its doors, Joseph knew something had cracked inside him tonight. Something small but significant, like the first fracture in ice before it breaks. He boarded the bus anyway, paid his fare, found a seat near the back, watched the conservatory disappear behind him, its windows glowing like a terrestrial constellation. The key in his pocket felt heavier than usual, and somewhere in the Whitmore Conservatory, in a practice room where the lights had been left off, where no one thought to look, an old upright piano sat waiting in the darkness. Joseph's apartment building stood on Mercer Street, wedged between a laundromat that had closed 3 years ago and a bodega that stayed open until midnight. The building itself was old enough to have history but not old enough to have charm. Just worn brick, rusted fire escapes, and windows that rattled when trucks passed. He'd lived on the 3rd floor for 9 years, longer than he'd worked at the conservatory, longer than he'd been in Boston. The hallway smelled like Mrs. Chen's cooking, ginger and garlic, something with star anise. Sure enough, when Joseph reached his door, he found a plastic container sitting on the mat with a post-it note pressed to the lid. "You work too much. Eat something real. Mrs. C." He smiled despite the weight in his chest, picking up the container. Still warm. She must have heard him coming up the stairs. Mrs. Chun had been a concert violinist in Shanghai 40 years ago, Before, arthritis and immigration and life had taken her in different directions. She never talked about it, but Joseph had seen the framed photographs in her apartment during the one time she'd invited him in for tea. A young woman on stage, violin tucked beneath her chin, eyes closed in concentration. They'd never discussed music, never acknowledged the connection. But she knew. Somehow, she knew. Inside his apartment, Joseph set down the container and surveyed his kingdom. 400 square feet of space that held his entire life. A bed that doubled as a couch. A kitchenette with 2 burners and a microwave that worked 3 days out of 5. A bathroom so small he could touch both walls while sitting on the toilet. A single window that looked out onto the alley and let in light for exactly 2 hours each afternoon. But the walls were his. Every inch of wall space not occupied by necessary fixtures held something related to music. Sheet music he'd collected from library sales, dollar stores, anywhere he could find it. Photographs torn from magazines. Glenn Gould at the piano, Horowitz in profile, Argerich with her wild hair. Posters from concerts he'd never attended. A framed program from the Boston Symphony Orchestra, playing Beethoven's Ninth, that someone had discarded in a subway station. And in the corner, covered with a bedsheet, sat his secret. Joseph didn't look at it yet. First, he changed out of his work clothes, hanging them carefully on the hook behind the bathroom door. Then he heated Mrs. Chen's food, some kind of noodle dish with bok choy and pork, the kind of home cooking that tasted like care. He ate standing at the window, watching the alley cats negotiate territorial disputes while the sky darkened completely. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "You get home okay? Gala's still going. Chun Wei is incredible. They're losing their minds up here." Joseph typed back. "Made it. Glad it's going well." Another buzz, almost immediately. "You should have heard her, man. The Ratch 3. Flawless. Got a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto. One of the most technically demanding pieces in the standard repertoire." Joseph knew every note, every impossible leap, every passage that separated the good from the transcendent. He set down his phone without responding. After finishing his meal, washing the container carefully so he could return it to Mrs. Chun tomorrow, Joseph finally allowed himself to look at the corner, at the shape beneath the bedsheet. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the fabric away. The keyboard was electronic, 76 keys, not the full 88 of a real piano. He'd bought it 7 years ago from a pawn shop for $60. Haggled down from 80 because several keys stuck and the volume knob crackled. He'd fixed it himself with videos from YouTube and patience, spending weeks on calibration until every key responded properly. It wasn't much. The touch was too light, the action too quick, nothing like the weighted keys of a real piano. The sound came from a small speaker that couldn't possibly reproduce the complexity of acoustic strings and hammers. But it was his secret, his solace, his rebellion against the life he'd accepted. Joseph plugged in his headphones, good ones, the one luxury he allowed himself, bought with 3 months of saved tips from a second job he'd worked at a coffee shop. He sat on the folding chair he kept for this purpose, positioned his hands over the keys, and closed his eyes. For a long moment he just breathed, let the day drain from his shoulders. Let go of Dr. Ashford's dismissive glance, the catering supervisor's contempt, the sound of applause for music he could only hear through walls. Then he began to play. His fingers found Chopin first, always Chopin. Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2. The melody lines singing above the flowing accompaniment, each note placed with the care of someone arranging flowers. This was music that didn't try to impress, music that simply existed in its own beautiful truth. Joseph played it slowly, savoring each phrase, his hands remembering what his heart needed. The electronic keyboard couldn't capture the richness of a real piano, couldn't give him the singing tone in the upper register, the thunderous power of the bass, the sympathetic resonance of strings vibrating in harmony. But it gave him enough to feel the music moving through him, enough to remember who he'd been before everything fell apart. He transitioned into Bach, Prelude in C major from the Well-Tempered Clavier. Simple, clear, the notes cascading like water over stones. This was music as mathematics, as architecture, as proof that beauty could exist in perfect structure. Joseph's hands moved with precision, each voice clear and distinct, the counterpoint weaving its intricate patterns. Time disappeared. One piece led to another, Debussy, Clair de Lune, its impressionist harmonies creating colors in his mind. Beethoven, the slow movement from the pathetic sonata, all yearning and nobility. Gershwin, Prelude No. 2, its jazz harmonies feeling like home in a way the classical repertoire sometimes didn't. He played for 2 hours without stopping, without thinking, letting muscle memory and emotion guide him through a landscape he'd been traveling since childhood. Here, in this tiny apartment with his inadequate keyboard and his second-hand dreams, Joseph Stewart was not a janitor, was not invisible, was not defined by the limitations others had placed on him or that life had imposed. Here he was simply himself, complete, whole. Finally, reluctantly, he let his hands still. The silence that followed felt profound, heavy with the ghost of sound. Joseph opened his eyes and found tears on his cheeks, though he couldn't remember when they'd started. This happened sometimes. Music had a way of opening doors he usually kept locked. He carefully covered the keyboard again, as if tucking in a child. Then he sat on his bed and did what he always did after playing. Remembered how he'd gotten here. Milwaukee, 1992. Joseph had been 6 years old when his mother, working 2 jobs and barely making rent, had come home with a small electric keyboard from a yard sale. $5, she'd said, setting it on their kitchen table with a mixture of pride and apology. I know it's not much, but I saw you watching that piano in the church basement. Thought maybe you'd like to mess around with this. He'd loved it immediately, taught himself to pick out melodies by ear, TV theme songs, pop songs from the radio, hymns from Sunday service. His mother, noticing his fascination, had scrimped and saved until she could afford lessons. $20 a month to Mrs. Kowalski, a retired piano teacher who lived 3 blocks away and smelled like peppermint and mothballs. Mrs. Kowalski had been strict, demanding, and the best thing that ever happened to him. She'd recognized something in Joseph, not just talent, but devotion. The willingness to practice scales until his fingers ached, to play passages over and over until they were perfect, to love music more than anything else in his small world. You have a gift, she told him when he was 10, after he'd played through a Beethoven sonata that should have been beyond his level. Not just in your hands, but in your heart. You understand what the music means. That's rarer than technique. By the time he was in high school, Joseph was the best pianist in Milwaukee's public school system. Won competitions, performed in recitals, got accepted into the city's performing arts magnet school on full scholarship. His teachers talked about conservatories, about Juilliard, about a future that glowed with possibility. His mother had cried when he showed her the acceptance letter to the Whitmore Conservatory. Full scholarship for undergraduate studies with the potential for more. Boston, one of the best music schools in the country. Her son, her brilliant boy, going to achieve what she'd never had the chance to pursue. He'd arrived in Boston at 18, full of fire and confidence and dreams. The conservatory had been everything he'd imagined, beautiful, intense, filled with music every moment of every day. He'd thrown himself into study, practicing 6, 8, 10 hours a day, making friends with other obsessives, learning from professors who'd performed with the Boston Symphony, the Met, in concert halls around the world. And then, halfway through his sophomore year, everything had shattered. His mother's cancer diagnosis came by phone, her voice trying to stay strong while delivering news that was anything but. Stage 4. Aggressive. The treatment would be expensive, brutal, and according to the doctors, probably futile. Joseph had left school immediately. No hesitation, no debate. He'd flown back to Milwaukee on a ticket he couldn't afford, had held his mother's hand through chemotherapy that made her violently ill, had watched her shrink and fade despite every prayer and hope. She died 4 months later, on a Tuesday morning in spring, holding his hand and telling him to go back to school, to finish what he'd started, to not let her death derail his dreams. But there had been medical bills, mountains of them. His mother had had some insurance, but not enough, never enough. The house had been remortgaged twice. There were credit card debts, payment plans, the accumulated weight of trying to stay alive in a country where survival came with a price tag. Joseph had spent the next year working 3 jobs, selling everything that wasn't essential, funneling every penny toward those debts. The conservatory had held his spot at first, had been understanding and sympathetic. But a year became 2, became 3. His scholarship was given to someone else. His momentum was gone. His calluses had softened. By the time the debts were paid, Joseph was 24 years old and exhausted in ways that sleep couldn't fix. He'd looked at the idea of going back to school, of trying to reclaim that life, and felt only overwhelming weariness. Too much time had passed. Too much had changed. Instead, he'd done what millions of people do. He'd gotten practical. Moved to Boston because he couldn't bear to stay in Milwaukee anymore, where every corner held memories. Found work. Found this apartment. Found a way to survive that didn't include dreams. The conservatory job had been accidental. He'd been cleaning office buildings, and one of his sites had been the Whitmore. When a janitor position opened up, he'd applied without thinking about the irony. It was steadier work, better pay, benefits. That it happened to be at the place where he was supposed to have become someone else seemed like the universe's idea of a joke. For 7 years now, he'd walked those halls as a ghost of his own potential. Seen students struggle with pieces he could play in his sleep. Listened to faculty discussions about interpretation and technique and artistry, adding nothing, acknowledged by no one. Cleaned the practice rooms where he should have been practicing. Polished the pianos he'd never touch. And every night, he came home to this apartment and played his electronic keyboard in silence, keeping his promise to music even if music had broken its promise to him. Joseph lay back on his bed, still fully dressed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a bird in flight. His phone buzzed again. Marcus, sending photos from the gala. The Steinway in all its glory, its black lacquer finish reflecting the crowd like a mirror. Chun Wei at the keys, her hands captured mid-flight. The standing ovation, a sea of elegant people on their feet. He looked at the photos for a long time, then turned off his phone. Tomorrow was Saturday. He had a shift at the warehouse from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., loading trucks with boxes he didn't care about. Then Sunday he was free, could maybe take the train to the public library, spend time reading in the music section, listening to recordings on their old CD players with headphones that smelled like disinfectant. It was a life, not the one he'd imagined, not the one his mother had died believing he'd have. But it was his, and he'd learned to carry it the way he carried everything else, with quiet dignity and no complaints. At midnight, Joseph finally changed into his sleep clothes, sweatpants and an old t-shirt from a 10K race he'd run 5 years ago. He brushed his teeth, set his alarm for 5 a.m., and climbed into bed. Through the thin walls, he could hear Mrs. Chen's television, the murmur of a late-night talk show. Someone upstairs was arguing in Spanish, their voices rising and falling in a familiar rhythm. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept returning to that moment outside Founders Hall. The way the light had spilled through those open doors. The sound of applause. Dr. Ashford's voice talking about dedication and sacrifice and the separation between the exceptional and the merely competent. Joseph wondered what she'd think if she knew that her janitor had once been offered a full scholarship to the institution she now ran. Wondered if it would change anything, if she'd see him differently, or if it would just be another piece of invisible information, irrelevant to his current function. Probably the latter. He rolled over, pulled the thin blanket up to his chin, and counted backward from 100 in French, an old trick Mrs. Kowalski had taught him for quieting a restless mind. By 63 he was drifting. By 47 he was gone. And in his dreams, Joseph Stewart sat at a beautiful piano in a concert hall filled with people who could see him, who wanted to see him, who'd come specifically to hear him play. His hands moved over the keys with confidence and joy, and the music that poured out was his own. Not Chopin or Bach or Beethoven, but something original, something true, something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed or made invisible. In his dreams, he was finally enough. The alarm would wake him in 5 hours, pulling him back to reality, back to the warehouse, back to the careful balance of survival and surrender he'd learned to maintain. But for now, Sleeping in his small apartment with the covered keyboard in the corner, and the key in his pocket and the remnants of Mrs. Chen's kindness in his belly, Joseph Stewart allowed himself the luxury of dreams. They were, after all, the one thing nobody could take away. The warehouse where Joseph worked weekends sat in an industrial district south of the city, surrounded by chain-link fences and loading docks that smelled like diesel and cardboard. He'd been here for 3 years now, ever since the conservatory had cut weekend custodial hours to save money. The work was brutally physical, lifting boxes that ranged from 5 to 70 pounds, scanning barcodes, loading them onto trucks with precision and speed that the supervisors monitored through handheld tablets. Joseph liked it specifically because it was nothing like music. There was no artistry in stacking boxes, no interpretation required for reading shipping labels. His body did the work while his mind went elsewhere, floating free, untethered. His coworkers were men and women who didn't ask personal questions, who measured others by how fast they moved and how much they could lift. Here, Joseph wasn't invisible. He was simply part of the machinery, another functional element in the system of commerce. Saturday morning arrived at 5 a.m. with the shock of his alarm. Joseph dragged himself from bed, dressed in jeans and a worn Carhartt jacket, grabbed a protein bar he couldn't afford but bought anyway because hunger made the work harder. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, just delivery trucks and the occasional taxi carrying people home from places Joseph would never go. The number 47 bus was nearly empty too. He sat in his usual spot, third row from the back on the right side, and watched Boston wake up through fingerprint-smudged windows. Bakeries turning on their lights, coffee shops setting out sandwich boards, dog walkers emerging with their charges, the animal's breath visible in the October cold. When Joseph arrived at the warehouse, the shift supervisor, a man named Rick who'd worked here 20 years and wore his exhaustion like a uniform, barely glanced up from his clipboard. "Stewart, Bay 4, we've got 3 trucks to load before noon. You're with Martinez and Cho today." "Got it." Bay 4 meant the heavy loads. Appliances, furniture, things that required 2 people and a dolly. Martinez was good. A guy in his 40s who'd worked construction before his knees went bad, who moved with careful efficiency and never wasted motion. Cho was younger, maybe 25, always had earbuds in, worked fast but sometimes sloppy. They worked without much conversation. The rhythm of labor took over. Scan, lift, carry, stack, repeat. Joseph's muscles warmed and then began to ache. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold. His mind drifted to the music he'd played last night, to the photographs Marcus had sent, to the question that had been growing in his since Friday evening, like a splinter working its way deeper. What would happen if they knew? Not just Dr. Ashford, but all of them. The faculty, the students, the donors in their expensive clothes. What would happen if Joseph Stewart, janitor, invisible presence, walking furniture, sat down at one of their precious pianos and played? The thought was absurd, laughable. He pushed it away and focused on the box in his hands. A dishwasher, according to the label, 68 pounds, heading to an address in Cambridge. "Yo, Joseph." Cho pulled out one earbud. "You good? You've been staring at that box for like 30 seconds. "Yeah, sorry. Just tired." "Ain't we all?" Martinez muttered, maneuvering a refrigerator onto the dolly with practiced ease. They broke for lunch at noon. Joseph ate his packed sandwich, peanut butter and banana, cheap and filling, sitting on a loading dock with his legs dangling over the edge. The industrial district stretched out before him, all concrete and metal, utterly without beauty but honest in its ugliness. No pretension here. No one pretending the world was more refined than it actually was. His phone buzzed. A text from Elena, his sister. "Thinking about you. How's work?" He typed back, "It's work. How are the kids?" Loud. "Expensive. Perfect. When are you coming to visit?" "Soon," he lied. He couldn't afford the bus ticket to Chicago, hadn't been able to afford it for 2 years now. Elena knew this but asked anyway, maintaining the fiction that distance was the only thing keeping them apart. Another text, "Mom would be proud of you, you know? You're surviving. That takes strength." Joseph stared at those words for a long time. Surviving, yes. But his mother hadn't raised him to survive. She'd raised him to thrive, to shine, to take the gifts he'd been given and make something beautiful with them. Survival was what happened when thriving became impossible. He didn't respond. Instead, he finished his sandwich and went back to work. The afternoon shift at the warehouse ended at 2 p.m. Joseph caught the bus back toward his neighborhood, but instead of going home, he got off 3 stops early and walked to the public library. Saturday afternoons were quiet there. Just a handful of people scattered among the stacks, the librarians speaking in hushed tones, the whole building existing in that peculiar library silence that felt like being underwater. The music section was on the 2nd floor, tucked in a back corner. Joseph had been coming here for years, knew the collection like some people knew their family trees. He ran his fingers along the spines, biographies of composers, books on music theory, collections of sheet music that were held together with tape and hope. He selected 3 books, one on Rachmaninoff, one analyzing the harmonic language of Debussy, and a collection of Scriabin's piano works he'd never seen before. Found his favorite chair, the one with the rip in the vinyl that had been there so long it felt intentional, and began to read. This was another form of practice. If he couldn't play the hours he needed to maintain his technique, he could at least maintain his understanding. Could study scores, analyze progressions, understand the architecture beneath the beauty. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was something. Joseph lost himself in Scriabin's mystical harmonies, in the composer's obsession with synesthesia and his belief that sound and color were intrinsically linked. The music on the page seemed to shimmer with possibility, each chord a doorway to somewhere else. He imagined playing the prelude in B-flat minor, his hands navigating its chromatic complexities, the way the harmonies would hang in the air like perfume. "Excuse me." The voice was soft, hesitant. Joseph looked up to find a young woman standing nearby, maybe 19 or 20, holding a stack of books against her chest like armor. She wore a Whitmore Conservatory sweatshirt. His stomach tightened. "Can I help you? I'm sorry to bother you, but..." She gestured to the book in his hands. "Are you studying Scriabin? I have a theory exam on Monday and I'm completely lost on his harmonic language." You looked like you actually understood what you were reading. Joseph's first instinct was to deflect, to make an excuse and leave. Being recognized by a conservatory student, even one who'd never seen him in his custodian uniform, felt dangerous somehow. But there was genuine desperation in her eyes, and old habits died hard. "What's confusing you?" he asked. She sat in the chair across from him, relief washing over her face. "All of it, honestly. The whole tone scales, the mystic chord, the way he builds tension without traditional dominant-tonic relationships. My professor keeps saying I need to hear it differently, but I don't know what that means." For the next 40 minutes, Joseph forgot to be invisible. He walked her through Scriabin's harmonic innovations, explaining how the composer had essentially created his own tonal language, one built on fourths rather than thirds, on ambiguity rather than resolution. He showed her patterns in the score, demonstrated theoretical concepts with his hands on the table as if it were a keyboard, broke down complex ideas into manageable pieces. The young woman, her name was Sarah, she finally mentioned, took notes frantically, her pen flying across the paper. "Oh my God. This makes so much more sense. My professor spent 2 weeks on this and I was just lost. How do you know all this?" Joseph paused, his openness slamming shut. "I read a lot." "You should be teaching," Sarah said earnestly. "Seriously, do you go to Whitmore? Are you grad student?" "No." "Well, you should. Or maybe Berkeley. You clearly have the knowledge." Joseph carefully closed the Scriabin book. "I should probably get going." "Wait." Sarah pulled out her phone. "Can I get your number? In case I have more questions? I could pay you for tutoring sessions. My parents are loaded and I'm desperate." "That's not necessary. Please?" "You explained in 40 minutes what Dr. Morrison couldn't make clear in 10 classes. I have money. Name your price." It would have been so easy to say yes, to take money he desperately needed for sharing knowledge he'd been carrying alone for years. But something about it felt wrong, felt like crossing a line he'd carefully maintained. Taking money would make it real, would make him something other than what he'd accepted being. "I can't," Joseph said, standing. "But good luck on your exam." He left before she could argue, before he could change his mind, before the need for money could outweigh the need to stay hidden. Outside the library, the afternoon had turned gray and cold. Joseph pulled his jacket tighter and started walking toward home. His phone buzzed, a call this time, not a text. "Marcus." "Hey man," Joseph answered. "Joseph, glad I caught you. Listen, something's come up. The conservatory needs extra cleaning tomorrow. Sunday. Some kind of emergency trustees meeting on Monday morning and they want everything spotless. Double pay for weekend work. You interested?" Double pay meant he could actually afford groceries that weren't ramen and peanut butter. "Yeah." "What time?" 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. "Just you and me. The building will be empty. Students are off on fall break. Faculty's gone. It'll be easy money." Joseph agreed and hung up. An empty conservatory. 8 hours alone with Marcus in a building full of pianos that no one would be using. The splinter in his mind pushed deeper. Sunday morning arrived with rain, cold, persistent October rain that turned the world gray and made Joseph's walk to the bus stop miserable. But the number 47 was warm and mostly empty, and when he arrived at the conservatory, Marcus was already there, standing under the portico with 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you'd need this," Marcus said, handing one over. "Black, 2 sugars, right? You're a good man, Marcus Webb. Don't I know it?" They entered the conservatory through the main entrance, a privilege usually reserved for students and faculty. The building felt different on Sundays, especially during fall break. The usual hum of activity was gone, replaced by a silence that felt almost sacred. Their footsteps echoed as they walked through the main hall, past the chandelier that cast no patterns today because the lights were dimmed, past the trophy cases full of awards and photographs of successful alumni. "Ashford wants the main hall, all classrooms, and Founders Hall deep cleaned," Marcus said, checking a list on his phone. "Also the practice rooms. Apparently some donor is touring facilities tomorrow and she wants everything perfect. We split it up, should be done by 3. "Sounds good." They collected supplies from the custodial closet and separated, Marcus taking the main hall and classrooms, Joseph heading toward the practice rooms. The eastern wing stretched before him, doors closed, windows dark. He started systematically, working room by room, vacuuming, dusting, cleaning windows, wiping down music stands. Each room had a piano, beautiful instruments maintained by professionals, worth more than Joseph made in a year. He cleaned around them carefully, professionally, not allowing his hands to touch the keys. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. But the building was empty. Just him and Marcus, separated by 3 hallways and 2 floors. And the splinter that had been working its way into his mind since Friday night was now lodged so deep it had become part of him. Impossible to ignore. In practice room 7, Joseph paused. This room had an upright Yamaha, less prestigious than the grand pianos in the larger studios but still a fine instrument. He looked at his cleaning supplies, then at the piano, then at the door. Closed. The hallway beyond it empty. His heart was hammering. This was insane. Childish. Pointless. He should just keep cleaning, keep his head down, maintain the careful balance he'd constructed. Instead, Joseph set down his spray bottle, walked to the piano, stood there for a long moment, just breathing. Then, quickly, before he could think better of it, he sat on the bench and placed his hands on the keys. The ivory was cool, smooth, perfectly weighted. Real piano action with all the responsiveness his electric keyboard lacked. The strings and hammers and resonance that made a piano more than just an instrument. Joseph played a single chord. C major. Simple. Safe. The sound bloomed in the small room, rich and full, hanging in the air like something physical. It had been 7 years since he'd touched a real piano. His eyes closed. His hands moved almost without conscious thought, finding Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The melody line sang. The left hand provided gentle support. And for 30 seconds, Joseph wasn't a janitor or a warehouse worker or a man whose dreams had collapsed. He was just someone making music. He stopped abruptly, hands frozen over the keys, shame flooding through him. What was he doing? This wasn't his. None of this was his. He was stealing something, not the instrument but the right to use it, the permission he'd never been granted. Joseph stood quickly, grabbed his supplies, and left the room without finishing the cleaning. Moved to the next practice room and worked with mechanical efficiency, not looking at the piano, not thinking about the feeling of those keys beneath his fingers. But the damage was done. The splinter had pushed through completely now, lodging itself somewhere vital. He finished the practice rooms by noon and moved to Founders Hall. The space still showed signs of Friday's gala. A few forgotten programs on chairs, a wine glass someone had left on a windowsill. The Steinway sat on its platform, uncovered now, no longer mysterious but simply present. Magnificent. Joseph cleaned around it methodically, swept the stage, wiped down the podium, polished the plaques on the walls naming donors and benefactors. All the while, the Steinway sat there, gleaming, perfect, practically radiating its own excellence. Beautiful, isn't it? Joseph spun to find Marcus standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed and an expression that was hard to read. "Yeah," Joseph managed. "It is. You play." The question hung in the air. Joseph could lie, should lie, maintain the careful separation he'd kept for 7 years. "Used to," he heard himself say instead. Marcus nodded slowly, unsurprised. "Thought so. Sometimes I see you pause outside the practice rooms. The way you listen, it's not how people who don't understand music listen. And that key you carry, the one you touch when you think no one's looking, it's a piano key, isn't it? From somewhere else. Some other life." Joseph's hand moved to his pocket instinctively, finding the key's familiar shape. He'd forgotten how observant Marcus was, how little escaped his attention despite the easygoing exterior. "Whitmore Conservatory, class that should have been 2016, Marcus continued. "I looked you up after you started here. Old registration records are online if you know where to search. Joseph Stewart, piano performance, full scholarship. Withdrawn after first year." "My mother got sick," Joseph said quietly. "She died. There were bills." "I'm sorry, man. That's rough." Marcus walked into the hall, stopping a respectful distance away. "Why'd you come back here? Why work at the place where you were supposed to be someone?" Joseph finished. "I don't know. Penance, maybe. Or stupidity. Or maybe I just couldn't stand to be completely away from music, even if I could only exist on its edges." They stood in silence for a moment, the Steinway between them like a challenge. "You should play it," Marcus said. "What?" "The Steinway. No one's here. Building's empty. I'm sure as hell not going to tell anyone." Marcus gestured to the piano. "When else are you going to get the chance?" "I can't." "Can't or won't?" Marcus challenged. "Look, I've been working security for 15 years. I've seen a lot of people move through this building. Students who think they're God's gift to music who can barely play scales. Rich kids who are here because their parents want them cultured, who'll never play again once they graduate. And I've seen people like you, people who actually hear the music, who it actually means something to. That's rare, Joseph. Why waste it? It's not mine to waste anymore. Isn't it?" Marcus checked his watch. "It's 12:30. I need to eat lunch. Takes me a good 45 minutes. I'm gonna lock the main entrance, set the alarm to stay put mode, and go sit in my office. When I come back at 1:15, this hall better be clean. What happens in between is between you and the piano." Before Joseph could respond, Marcus walked out, his footsteps fading down the corridor. And then there was silence. Complete, total silence. Just Joseph Stewart and a Steinway worth more than 3 years of his salary, sitting in an empty hall with 45 minutes stretching before him like an open door. He should keep cleaning. Should wipe down the chairs, polish the windows, vacuum the carpet. Should do his job and nothing more. Instead, Joseph walked slowly to the platform, climbed the 3 steps, stood before the Steinway. It was even more beautiful up close. The black lacquer finish flawless, the Hamburg Steinway logo elegant in its simplicity, the keys perfect and gleaming. He sat on the bench, adjusted its height, positioned his hands above the keys. Then he began to play. Beethoven first. Sonata number 14 in C-sharp minor, the Moonlight Sonata. He started with the famous first movement, those rippling triplets that felt like water under moonlight, the melody emerging from the darkness like something remembered rather than heard. His hands remembered everything, every nuance, every dynamic, every place where Beethoven's genius turned something simple into something transcendent. The Steinway responded like a living thing. Every note sang with clarity, the bass notes rumbling with power, the high notes crystalline and pure. This was what he'd been missing, what his electric keyboard could never provide. The dynamic range, the tonal color, the way the instrument became an extension of his body rather than a separate object. He moved into the second movement, more energetic, almost playful, providing contrast to the melancholy that preceded it. Then the third movement, the presto agitato, his hands flying over the keys, the music building to its passionate climax. 7 years of silence poured out through his fingers, 7 years of cleaning around beauty without touching it, 7 years of invisible presence. When the Beethoven ended, Joseph didn't stop. He transitioned immediately into Rachmaninoff, the prelude in C-sharp minor. He'd heard someone practicing Friday evening. This was different music, more romantic, more emotional, building to that famous climax with its massive chords that required hands to stretch impossibly wide. The Steinway handled it perfectly, the bass notes thunderous, the treble ringing like bells. Then Chopin, Ballade number 1 in G minor, a piece he'd learned at 17 and played in his audition for Whitmore. This was storytelling through music, the way Chopin could make the piano speak in complete sentences, in paragraphs, in poetry. Joseph played with everything he had, all the technique he'd maintained through his electric keyboard, all the emotion he'd been holding back, all the dreams he'd deferred. Time stopped. The world narrowed to just his hands, the keys, the sound-filling Founders Hall with music it was built to hold. Joseph played piece after piece, Bach and Debussy and Gershwin, classical and romantic and impressionist, moving through the repertoire like someone taking inventory of their entire history. He was crying. Didn't realize it until tears dripped onto the keys, but he couldn't stop. This was grief, yes, for his mother, for his lost career, for the life that should have been. But it was also joy, pure, uncomplicated joy at making music again on an instrument worthy of it, in an acoustic space designed for it. Finally, 40 minutes after he'd started, Joseph let his hands still. The last chord, Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, that famous clarinet glissando translated for solo piano, hung in the air, then faded slowly into silence. He sat there, breathing hard, his whole body trembling. Jesus Christ! Joseph's head snapped up. Marcus stood in the doorway, his lunch forgotten in his hands, staring at Joseph with an expression of complete shock. "How long have you been there?" Joseph asked, his voice rough. "Long enough. Joseph, I knew you could play, but I didn't." Marcus shook his head. "That was professional level. Better than professional. Better than most of the faculty here. It's been 7 years. I'm rusty. If that's rusty, I'd hate to see you sharp. My God, man." Marcus walked into the hall, setting his lunch down on a chair. "Why aren't you performing? Teaching? Doing literally anything except mopping floors?" Joseph stood from the bench, suddenly exhausted. "Because life doesn't work that way, Marcus. Talent isn't enough. You need money, opportunity, connections. You need to not have your mother die when you're 20. You need to not have $50,000 in medical debt before you're old enough to rent a car. The world doesn't care how well you play piano if you're too busy surviving to play it. That's not fair." "No," Joseph agreed. "It's not. But it's true." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, "What if someone heard you? Really heard you? They'd hear a janitor playing piano he shouldn't be touching. Nothing would change." "You don't know that." "Yes, Marcus, I do. Because I've spent 7 years watching how this place works. Watching rich kids get opportunities because their parents donate buildings. Watching mediocre students succeed because they have the right last names. Watching people like me, People who actually love music, who'd give anything for a chance, get overlooked because we don't fit the image. Joseph gestured around Founders Hall. This whole building is dedicated to the memory of people with money. Not talent. Money. Joseph. I need to finish cleaning, Joseph interrupted. Thank you for giving me those 40 minutes. I needed it more than you know. But let's not pretend it means anything beyond what it was. A moment. That's all. He walked past Marcus, grabbed his cleaning supplies, and left Founders Hall without looking back at the Steinway. For the rest of the shift, Joseph worked in silence. Marcus tried several times to restart the conversation, but Joseph shut him down gently, firmly, finally. They finished by 3 p.m., as predicted. Marcus set the alarms, locked the doors, and they walked to the employee parking lot together. I'm not going to say anything to anyone, Marcus said as they reached his car, about what I heard today. That's your business. I appreciate that. But Joseph, you can't just let it die. What you have, what you can do, it's too rare, too important. Joseph didn't respond. He walked to the bus stop, caught the number 47, and rode home in silence. In his apartment, he uncovered his electric keyboard, sat down, tried to play. But after the Steinway, after 40 minutes of music the way it was meant to be made, the electric keys felt like toys. The sound was tinny, hollow, insufficient. He covered the keyboard again and lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Sleep on it. That's all I'm asking. Just sleep on it. Joseph didn't respond. But he knew sleep wouldn't come easy tonight, because for 40 minutes in an empty hall, he'd remembered exactly who he was supposed to be. And now, lying in his small apartment with the water stain on the ceiling and the covered keyboard in the corner, he had to figure out how to forget it all over again. Monday morning arrived with the kind of cold that made the bus windows fog up from passenger breath. Joseph sat in his usual spot, watching Boston slide past in blurred impressions. Office buildings, coffee shops, the river reflecting gray sky like metal. He'd barely slept, his mind cycling between the feeling of the Steinway beneath his fingers and the reality of his Monday shift at the conservatory. When he arrived, the building was alive again. Fall break had ended and students flooded the hallways, their chatter filling spaces that had been silent yesterday. Joseph changed into his uniform, collected his supplies, and started with the main hall. He was mopping near the administrative wing when he heard his name. Joseph Stewart? He turned to find Dr. Catherine Ashford standing with Professor Helena Zhao and a man Joseph didn't recognize, late 50s, expensive suit, the kind of confidence that came from old money and older institutions. Yes, ma'am, Joseph said, gripping the mop handle. This is Gregory Pemberton, Dr. Ashford said, gesturing to the man. Of the Pemberton Foundation. He was inquiring about our custodial staff's background checks and employment history. Joseph's stomach tightened. Had Marcus said something? Had someone seen him playing yesterday? Is there a problem? No problem, Pemberton said, his voice cultured, accent suggesting Harvard or Yale. Simply doing due diligence. The Foundation takes security very seriously, given the value of instruments and materials on premises. Joseph has been with us for 7 years, Dr. Ashford said, her tone suggesting this conversation was an inconvenience. Impeccable record. We've never had issues. Of course, Pemberton agreed, but his eyes stayed on Joseph with uncomfortable intensity. 7 years. That's considerable tenure for a custodial position. Most people move on to other opportunities. The statement hung in the air, not quite a question but demanding an answer. I like the work, Joseph said simply. It's steady. Pemberton pulled out his phone, tapped something, then looked back at Joseph. Joseph Stewart. Would you happen to have studied music at some point? Perhaps here at Whitmore? The question landed like a stone in still water. Joseph felt Professor Zhao's attention sharpen, saw Dr. Ashford's expression shift from impatience to confusion. I attended briefly, Joseph said carefully. Years ago. It didn't work out. Fascinating, Pemberton said, though his tone suggested he'd already known the answer. And yet you chose to return as custodial staff. That must be. He searched for a word. Challenging. Mr. Pemberton, Dr. Ashford interrupted, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of conversation. Was there something specific you needed regarding building security? Actually, yes. Pemberton's smile didn't reach his eyes. I'd like to review footage from our security cameras, particularly from yesterday, Sunday. The Founders Hall cameras specifically. Joseph's blood went cold. I'm sorry. Dr. Ashford looked confused. Why would you need yesterday's footage? The building was closed. Not entirely closed, Pemberton said. I believe there were custodial staff present. I'd simply like to review the security protocols. Ensure everything was properly locked down. Marcus. The footage would show Marcus letting Joseph into Founders Hall. Would show Joseph playing the Steinway for 40 minutes. Would show exactly what Joseph had been trying to keep hidden for 7 years. I can pull that footage, Professor Zhao offered. But Gregory, what's this really about? Pemberton's attention never left Joseph. Let's just say I have an interest in knowing exactly who has access to our most valuable instruments, and how they use that access when no one is watching. Joseph has never, Dr. Ashford started, but Pemberton raised a hand. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, simply exercising appropriate oversight. He finally looked away from Joseph, turning to Dr. Ashford. Catherine, might we use your office? This won't take long. They walked away, leaving Joseph standing with his mop in a hallway that suddenly felt too small, too bright, too exposed. Students flowed around him, talking, laughing, completely unaware that his carefully constructed world was collapsing. He should run, should leave the building, quit via text message, disappear before they reviewed that footage. But his legs wouldn't move, his hands wouldn't release the mop handle. Joseph! Marcus appeared at his elbow, his face tight with worry. I'm so sorry, man. Pemberton showed up this morning demanding to see yesterday's security logs. The system automatically flags any after-hours access to the Steinway room. I tried to explain that we were doing authorized cleaning, but he insisted on reviewing footage. It's not your fault. Like hell it isn't. I'm the one who told you to play. I'm the one who... Mr. Webb. Dr. Ashford's voice cut across the hallway. She stood in her office doorway, her expression unreadable. Mr. Stewart, both of you, please. Now. They walked to her office like convicts approaching sentencing. Inside, Pemberton sat at Ashford's desk as if he owned it, a laptop open in front of him showing frozen security footage. A grainy image of Joseph sitting at the Steinway, hands on the keys, frozen mid-performance. Professor Zhao stood by the window, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between confused and curious. Sit, Dr. Ashford said, gesturing to 2 chairs facing her desk. They sat. Pemberton pressed play. The footage was silent but clear enough. Joseph entering Founders Hall, approaching the Steinway, sitting, and then, though there was no audio, the visible evidence of playing. His hands moving over the keys, his body swaying slightly with the music, the focused intensity of his expression. The timestamp showed 42 minutes of footage. Pemberton let it play for 2 minutes, then paused. Mr. Stewart, he said, his tone impossible to read. You played our Hamburg Steinway, an instrument worth $185,000, without authorization for nearly 43 minutes yesterday. Is this correct? Joseph met his gaze. Yes, sir. And you, Mr. Webb, you were aware this was happening? Marcus straightened. I gave him permission. The building was secure, no one else was present, and I was monitoring. If there's disciplinary action, it should be directed at me, not Joseph. I see. Pemberton closed the laptop. And neither of you thought this might constitute a violation of trust? A misuse of your positions? With respect, Mr. Pemberton, Marcus said. Joseph cleaned that piano more gently than I've seen some students treat it. He didn't damage anything. That's not the point. Then what is the point? The question came from Professor Zhao, who'd moved from the window to stand behind Pemberton's chair. Gregory, you pulled us all into this office to watch surveillance footage of a janitor playing piano during his lunch break. Unauthorized, yes, but hardly criminal. The point, Pemberton said slowly, is that we have someone with apparently substantial musical training working as custodial staff, with access to valuable instruments, and we knew nothing about it. I never hid my background, Joseph said quietly. It's in my employment records. I attended Whitmore for 1 year. It's not a secret. Dr. Ashford, who'd been silent until now, pulled up something on her own computer. Her eyes scanned quickly, and Joseph watched her expression change as she found his old student file. Piano performance, 2014 to 2015, she read aloud. Full merit scholarship. Withdrew in good academic standing. She looked up at Joseph. Why didn't I know this? Because no one asked, Joseph replied. And it didn't seem relevant. I'm a janitor now. What I was 9 years ago doesn't matter. Doesn't it? Professor Zhao leaned forward, her previous annoyance replaced by something else. Interest, perhaps, or recognition. Gregory, why exactly did you flag this? What made you review yesterday's footage in the first place? Pemberton was quiet for a moment. Then, because I was here yesterday, briefly around 1 p.m. I'd forgotten some documents in my car and came back to retrieve them. And as I was walking past Founders Hall, I heard someone playing. The room went silent. I stood outside those doors, Pemberton continued, and listened to someone play Rachmaninoff's C-sharp minor prelude with more passion and technical precision than I've heard in years. Not in the conservatory, not in the concert halls I frequent, not anywhere. I assumed it was faculty, or perhaps a guest artist we'd somehow failed to mention. When I looked at the security logs and saw it was, he gestured at Joseph, a custodian, I'll admit I was skeptical. Skeptical of what? Marcus demanded. Of whether the playing I heard could have been from him. Whether perhaps faculty had been in the building and the security logs were somehow incorrect. Pemberton reopened his laptop, clicked through to another file. So I had our security system pull audio as well. We installed audio recording in Founders Hall after the new Steinway was delivered. For insurance purposes. He pressed play again. This time, sound accompanied the video. And there it was, Joseph's playing, captured in all its glory. The Beethoven Moonlight Sonata flowing from the laptop speakers. Tinny but unmistakable. Even through the computer's inadequate audio, the musicality was evident. The control, the emotion, the way Joseph shaped each phrase with intentionality and grace. Dr. Ashford's hand had moved to cover her mouth. Professor Zhao had gone very still, her eyes fixed on the laptop screen. Marcus looked like he was trying to decide whether to be proud or terrified. Pemberton let the Beethoven play for 3 minutes, then switched to another timestamp. The Rachmaninoff prelude, that famous opening building to its crushing climax. Then Chopin. Then a snippet of the Gershwin that had ended Joseph's session. When Pemberton finally stopped the playback, the office was silent except for the ambient sounds of the conservatory. Students in the hallway, a distant trumpet running scales, the building's heating system clicking on. Mr. Stewart, Pemberton said, his tone entirely different now. Where did you train? Here, Joseph said quietly. And with a private teacher in Milwaukee before that. Mrs. Kowalski. And you've been working as a janitor while playing like that? Professor Zhao shook her head. That's insane. That's, Joseph, you're better than half my faculty. Better than most of my students. I was, Joseph corrected. That was 7 years ago. I haven't touched a real piano since then. That wasn't 7 years ago, Pemberton said. That was yesterday. And if that's you after 7 years without practice, I'd give anything to hear you at full capacity. Joseph felt something shifting in the room, the dynamics changing, the power structure becoming unclear. He glanced at Dr. Ashford, trying to gauge her reaction, but her face was unreadable. Dr. Ashford, Joseph said carefully, I apologize for using the Steinway without authorization. Marcus was trying to do something kind, and I should have declined. If you want my resignation, don't be ridiculous, she interrupted, her voice sharp, then softer. I'm trying to understand. You were a full scholarship student. You left in good standing. Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you finish your degree? So Joseph told them. About his mother's cancer. About the medical bills that swallowed every penny he could earn. About watching her die at 20 years old and emerging from that grief with $50,000 in debt and no way to return to school. About choosing survival over dreams because survival was all he could afford. When he finished, the office was quiet again. Professor Zhao had tears in her eyes. Marcus was staring at his hands. Even Pemberton looked uncomfortable. "The debt," Dr. Ashford said finally. "Is it still outstanding?" "No. I paid it off 3 years ago." "Then why didn't you reapply? Come back to finish your degree?" Joseph laughed, a sound without humor. "With what money, Dr. Ashford? I make $32,000 a year. I work a second job on weekends to afford my apartment and food. The scholarship I had was merit-based and time-sensitive. It doesn't exist for students who left 8 years ago. And even if I could somehow afford tuition, I've lost years of practice time. Everyone here is younger, better prepared, still connected to that world. I'm 30 years old. I'd be the oldest person in every class, the janitor who tried to become a student again." Joseph's voice was steady. "I made peace with that. I found a different life. A lesser life," Professor Zhao said quietly. "Not because custodial work isn't valuable, it absolutely is, but because you're denying what you were meant to do, what you were born to do." "I'm not denying it," Joseph replied. "I'm surviving alongside it. There's a difference." Pemberton closed his laptop with deliberate care. What if survival wasn't the only option anymore? Everyone looked at him. "The Pemberton Foundation," he continued, "has a mandate to support exceptional musical talent, particularly talent that has been overlooked or underserved by traditional systems. We provide full scholarships, living stipends, performance opportunities, everything necessary to allow someone to focus entirely on their artistry." Joseph's heart was hammering. "Mr. Pemberton, I heard you play yesterday," Pemberton interrupted, "and I'm hearing you now through that recording. You don't need to be discovered, Mr. Stewart. You need to be supported. There's a difference." He looked at Dr. Ashford. "Catherine, if I endowed a full adult learner scholarship, tuition, fees, living expenses, everything, would Whitmore be able to accommodate a returning student?" Dr. Ashford's eyes were bright. "We've never had an adult learner program in piano performance, but we could create one. For the right candidate. Then I'd like to propose exactly that. Pilot program. 1 student to start." Pemberton looked at Joseph. "If he's willing." The room spun. Joseph gripped the armrests of his chair, trying to process what he was hearing. "I can't accept charity." "It's not charity," Professor Zhao said firmly. "It's recognition. Gregory, if you're serious about this, I want Joseph in my advanced studio. I'll work with him personally." "But the other students," Joseph protested. "The faculty, I'm the janitor. I clean their practice rooms. How am I supposed to?" "You're not the janitor anymore," Dr. Ashford said. "Effective immediately, you're on educational leave. Paid until the scholarship processes. And then you're a student, a pianist. What you should have been all along." Marcus, silent until now, leaned over and gripped Joseph's shoulder. "Take it, man. Stop arguing and just take it." Joseph looked around the office at these people who, 45 minutes ago, he'd thought were about to fire him. At Marcus, who'd given him 40 minutes that changed everything. At Professor Zhao, who was looking at him like he was valuable. At Dr. Ashford, whose dismissive glances had cut him for years, but who now saw him differently. "I need to think," Joseph said, his voice breaking slightly. It's too much. Too fast." "Think quickly," Pemberton said, "but not unkindly. The spring semester starts in January. That gives us 3 months to process paperwork, arrange housing, establish the scholarship program. But I need your commitment soon." Joseph stood on shaking legs. "Can I have until tomorrow?" "Of course," Dr. Ashford said gently. "Joseph, go home. Take the rest of the day. This is paid time. Just think about it." He nodded, left the office, walked through the conservatory in a daze. Students passed him, unseeing as always, But now it felt different. Now invisibility felt like a costume he could remove rather than a permanent condition. Outside, the October air was sharp and clean. Joseph walked to his bus stop, boarded the number 47, rode home through the city that suddenly looked different, brighter, full of possibility. In his apartment, he uncovered his electric keyboard, looked at it for a long moment. Then he played, not perfectly, not with the power of the Steinway, but with something new. Hope, maybe, or permission to imagine a different ending. When he finished, Joseph pulled out his phone and called Elena. "Joey." Her voice was surprised. "Everything okay?" "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I think it might be." And then he told her everything. 3 years later, Joseph Stewart walked onto the stage of Boston's Symphony Hall wearing a tuxedo that actually fit, purchased with money from his first paid performance. The audience was packed, 3,000 people who'd come to hear the Pemberton Foundation's annual showcase concert. In the third row, Mrs. Chun sat next to Marcus Webb, both of them beaming. Dr. Ashford was there, and Professor Zhao, and Elena with her family, her kids wide-eyed at the grandeur. And in the front row, Gregory Pemberton waited with the expression of someone who'd made an excellent investment. Joseph sat at the Steinway, not the conservatory's Hamburg model, but Symphony Hall's concert grand. He positioned his hands, took a breath, and began to play Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, the piece Marcus had texted him about years ago, the piece that had started everything. But this time Joseph wasn't alone. This time he had an orchestra behind him, and an audience before him, and a future that extended beyond survival. The music poured out. All his grief, his resilience, his mother's love, his years of silence, his rediscovered voice. Every note was a declaration. I am here. I am seen. I am enough. When the final chord faded, the silence lasted 3 heartbeats. Then the audience rose as one, and the applause was thunder. Thank you for listening to Joseph Stewart's story. A reminder that talent deferred is not talent denied, and that being seen can change everything. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of resilience, recognition, and the power of second chances. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story about ordinary people doing extraordinary things.